in residency, I wrote the kind of outline and some rough draft of Residency 2.0. And I'd love to create a course to follow up on the Med School 2.0 book that helps people who are really wanting to take the leap master this use of electronic flashcards and retrieval practice as the primary mode of learning.
Welcome to the Medical Mnemonist Podcast, your source for memory techniques and accelerated learning in higher education. Now, here's your host, Chase DeMarco.
Welcome to the Medical Mnemonist Podcast. Today we have Dr. David Larson, author of Medical School 2.0, an unconventional guide to learn faster, ace the USMLE, and get into your top choice in residency. Dr. Larson, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Chase.
I'm so glad you're joining us today. I know this is going to be a very useful interview for our audience. So, Dr. Larson, brief bits about your history. I was able to pull up some interesting highlights here. Looks like you went to Brown University, then spent a year in Spain on the Fulbright Fellowship, then worked in a grassroots public health program in India before joining USC School of Medicine, earning top marks and the Alpha Omega Alpha Merit Scholarship. That's quite a list already. How did you accomplish all of that?
I think hindsight's always 20/20. It wasn't all planned from the beginning. The Fulbright, I never got to study abroad because there was so many pre-med requirements, and I always wanted to go abroad. And so I think one of the admissions counselors told me about the Fulbright. I'm like, what's the harm in applying? And meanwhile, I'd lined up other jobs. I was actually going to go into consulting for a few years, but at the end, May before I graduated, they told me I got accepted for the Fulbright, so I canceled the other plans and went off to Spain. And that was an amazing year. Around that time, I think I read the book Mountains Beyond Mountains. Have you ever read that?
Not yet, but I do remember reading about that in your book, so it's on my to-do list.
Yeah, I mentioned it because Paul Farmer was one of the kind of inspirational figures for how he went about med school. He was at Harvard, but was in Haiti for much of med school, setting up a clinic, and would just fly back for tests. And had a special arrangement with the dean there. So I read that book. I was very inspired, wanted to explore global public health, and applied to the Peace Corps and a few other options. I ended up going to this place in India called Jamshedpur because someone at a nonprofit consulting group who had been consulting with nonprofits for 20 years said, this is the best run nonprofit in public health I've ever come across. If you have the opportunity to go there, you got to go there. So I just cold called them and said, hey, I'd like to come and help however I can. Got there. Of course, I wasn't good at helping with medicine. I hadn't been trained yet, but I ended up bringing a video camera and was able to capture on video kind of what makes all their programs unique so that they could use those videos for fundraising and education. So it ended up being super useful for them, and we're still friends to this day. So I digress, but lots of different adventures along the way.
Seems like an amazing opportunity and maybe set forward the stepping stones to a lot of the traveling you did during your book.
Yeah, and traveling's kind of always been a part of my life, and I did it initially in med school. I think I mentioned in the book how I burnt out pretty early on, and that was a new experience for me. I hadn't been through burnout before. It kind of came down to the point where it was untenable, and I wasn't going to stay in med school if it meant I had to give up my soul, my spirit, and all the other things in life that brought me so much joy.
And burnout seems to be an ever-increasing awareness, not only for physicians, but also in medical school. So yeah. That's amazing. I definitely want to dig into that in just a moment. So your book came out in 2014, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure. That's probably right.
And then you also did a TED Talk in Vancouver in 2016, which I was able to watch the other day.
Yes, and it's funny because I was singing Cyndi Lauper, I couldn't get unlimited rights from her agent to post it on TED.com. And so I can still post it, but they can't officially post it on TED unless Sony Music Group signs a form for unlimited rights, which they just won't do. So that's kind of a funny thing. I didn't realize by singing her, it couldn't be on TED, but that was quite a exhilarating and terrifying experience.
And I guess we also always have to watch out for copyright infringement.
Yeah.
So you're currently board certified in family medicine. You did a dual residency for family med and psychiatry, correct?
Yeah, and I'm board certified in psychiatry as well. And integrative medicine doesn't have a board certification. They're working on it, but I did the integrative medicine and residency fellowship through Andrew Weil's program at University of Arizona.
Okay, interesting. So sounds like you're still building up quite the resume every year.
Yeah, that I finished all those. It was about a 6-year residency last year. And so now I'm working in my own practice.
Okay, great. So let's delve into a little bit more about your medical school experiences, how you managed your studies, finances, a lot of the topics that I'm assuming were very influential in certain chapters of your book.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so med school, kind of as I mentioned, it was, and I think a lot of people have been through this experience where you feel pretty good about yourself, your studies, you made it into med school, and then all of a sudden you're with a group of peers who have all done the same, and keeping up becomes even more difficult. And I was really struggling with just the quantity of workload and hours of lecture and labs, and stopped exercising, stopped kind of cooking. I was eating less healthy, started to have study time budge into sleep time. So I was sleeping less and just feeling worse and worse. Tried to look for help. I went, they had a PhD educational psychologist. I think she was saying to read a half an hour to an hour pre-read per lecture and then study half an hour to an hour per lecture afterwards. And you add it all up. If you're in 8 hours of lecture, or even 4 hours, it's just a crazy workday. But I started by doing that and taking those recommendations. And like I told you, I burned out in about 3 months. And I think the defining moment was when I worked my butt off, got the first test results back, and it was kind of a low C. And so after that, I'm like, oh, shoot, this isn't going to work. And so I started talking to some of the 3rd and 4th year students who seemed like they had good grades, but also more balanced lifestyles. It was really amazing what I started to find out. I mean, one person, the first time I asked someone, they turned me on. They're like, oh, have you heard of Afshin's notes? So just that one resource alone, saved an incredible amount of time. So it was the concept that there's got to be a better way, and then asking for help and thinking outside the box, realizing that there's probably a solution out there that I'm not aware of. That's kind of where it started.
That's extremely useful. I know something that everyone did in my med school was asking the older class what resources to use, what they recommend for each teacher. And I think you covered this in a section of your book too. The way you ask the question, garbage in, garbage out, you're not always going to get the most useful information. So good thing you seem to have an entire school basically that agreed that there's one resource to use and it was going to be very succinct and useful and help out the student body a lot. Yeah,
and that was just one of the things. Other people were telling me about using flashcards, and there's a few people who had different ways of doing them. So I experimented with those. And also as I talked to them, they gave me a little perspective on kind of what's prioritizing what's important. So if I'm looking at the investment of my time and energy and the return on investment, low on the priority list is the grades on my exams the first 2 years. And so if I study board resources for cardiology, I'm going to do good enough on the cardiology system exam. I'm not going to do as good as if I studied the lecture notes primarily. However, I'm going to be much more prepared for the boards. So I decided to make that sacrifice and that decision, and I was so glad I did, because by the time boards came around, I was not stressed. I wasn't studying that much. It's like I'd already been studying that for over a year.
And that seems like a perfect segue, because one of the things I really wanted to discuss with you, being a show about accelerated learning and study hacks, is your flashcard method. It seems to be a little unique and something that's gained a lot of popularity from your book. So what is it that makes your flashcard technique a little different or so efficient?
And I guess I'd put a caveat in there that I wouldn't call it my flashcard technique. The amount of research on retrieval practice is just exploding in the past few years, and it is clearly, without doubt, the best way to learn. And retrieval practice has been compared to every single way we know of studying, and it has beat every single one. Flashcards is a type of retrieval practice, and I think there's many different ways to do it. I don't think my way is, the only way, or maybe not even the best way. Again, there could be other ways that I haven't experimented with, and someone may invent an even better way, and I hope they do. I kind of see us as a team collaborating on how do we learn more efficiently, because if we can get the learning we need in a shorter amount of time, then we have that time available for self-care and for living our lives. So that's kind of my big goal. But with that caveat, I'll tell you the flashcard method I arrived at is basically trimming. Have you heard of the 80-20 rule?
Yes. The Italian rule, I believe you call it in your book.
Yeah. And so I first heard about that from Tim Ferriss. As I experimented with that in my life, it just held a lot of validity. So it's starting out with thinking, all right, what am I going to actually study? And narrowing down the 20% of study resources that will give me 80% of the learning knowledge that I want. And so it was being very intentional, not just studying what the school told me to study or the recommended reading, but choosing sources that were, recommended, well validated, kind of like if you're going to buy a new computer monitor. You might look at reviews and see what's the best value for my money. So it's the same sort of concept, but instead of money, it's your life energy you're investing. And then once I choose a source, the screenshot method of making flashcards was so much faster than typing. So I started doing that, and I screenshot a paragraph of text without really reading it into the answer part of a flashcard. Do the entire chapter, make flashcards, which only took about 10 minutes. And then I would study them one at a time. And by that, I mean I would just read that paragraph. And while I read it, I would type customized questions and just shorthand questions in the top part of the flashcard. So definition of cardiomyopathy or types of cardiomyopathy. And the key part there, which is different than using someone else's flashcard deck, is the way each of our brains are wired is really unique. And the knowledge gaps are going to be different from all of us. So if I use someone else's flashcards, it's going to have words written in the way that are unique to that person's brain, which may or may not overlap with what I really need to learn and the way I think about it and trigger the retrieval practice. That's the benefit of writing my own questions quickly. And I would basically do them 5 at a time and then do immediate retrieval practice to make sure I got all 5 of those cards right. And then I'd move on to the next 5. And each deck of cards was around 15 to 35 cards, I'd say. And I'd start with the highest yield resources like first aid. At that time, it was also Goyan, rapid review of pathology, if I'm remembering right. And I'm sure there's even better resources now. I haven't really kept up with that.
I think now Pathoma, for one, is highly recommended by most students for pathology review. Goyan, which I can never pronounce properly, is still usually mentioned. I'm not sure if it's as high yield as it used to be or as highly recommended. One that I always hear about for flashcards in particular is the pre-made Brosencephalon Anki deck.
Yeah.
And obviously Anki being one of the probably more popular flashcard decks, especially in medical school, and allows you to share your decks with others. I know that's received a lot of popularity in the past. But as you said, I know one of the issues I had with flashcards was using others and not making my own, so it didn't stick as well.
Yeah, and I think I've heard really good things about that deck as well. And I think what really matters is that people develop the habit of using retrieval practice as the primary method of learning in medical school, period. If it works better for them to use someone else's deck, like the Brosencephalon, then I would use a deck like that that is very well rated and well respected. You don't want to just use someone else's deck that you don't know about or you don't trust, because it's even more dangerous to risk putting inaccurate information in your brain then you're going to have what's called a recognition bias. And so it's harder to unlearn that. That's part of why I never really like to go to groups, because of a lot of our PBL groups were people discussing possible answers to questions, but usually discussing inaccurate answers. And so just spending that mental energy on the discussion, it would interfere with my learning the accurate answers and systems and actually have a negative impact on my overall learning. So I would actually skip those on purpose.
That sounds like a very good recommendation. I can't tell you how many times I learned something incorrectly from another source and then always got that wrong on questions afterwards, because that's just how I first remembered it.
Yeah.
From the flashcard decks being one of the aspects that really, at least to me, stood out as a unique way to make your own deck and study habits. But another one was you seem to be very, very organized and scheduled and able to keep track or self-assess your ability to schedule and where your weaknesses were to correct them. Can you discuss that a little bit more? What sort of tools or tasks or self-assessments might students find useful?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One of the most important tools to cultivate is mindfulness. It is one of the most evidence-based practices for stress reduction, for health, for learning and memory, so many different things. There's really no excuse why we shouldn't all have a mindfulness practice. What mindfulness meditation does is it helps to cultivate a sense of internal awareness, moment to moment, non-judgmental awareness of thoughts, feelings, emotions, body sensations. So when I was studying, I was probably more in touch than people who haven't been meditating with my internal state. And I would notice after about an hour and a half, it took me about 20 minutes to really get into the study session. And then it was really fun and engaging. And, it's stimulating for the brain to work on difficult problems. And I could speed up the pace of the flashcards to make it difficult enough to sustain my attention. So it was in this perfect zone where I felt like time stopped. If I didn't stop myself, I could go for almost 3 hours. But if I did go for 3 hours, I would feel so irritable and angry at the end of that. I'd have to take a 2-hour break doing something in order to get my brain back in a state where I'd even want to think about studying. So I just started experimenting, and I found for me, the sweet spot was around 90 minutes. When 90 minutes came, I wouldn't be aware that it came. So I had to set a little timer on my phone to stop. And then when I stopped at 90 minutes and just took a 20-minute break to get some coffee or tea or do some emails or talk with a friend, I found the kind of sweet spot study schedule for me was an hour and a half, a 20 or 30-minute break, another hour and a half, and then a longer break. By the time I got into this, it was only about usually 1 or 2 of those sessions per day. And that's total.
So it sounds like a personally edited, I always mispronounce this too, Pomodoro technique, where you take 20 minutes of study time, take a break. But no medical student is going to be able to deal with 20 minutes at a time. So an extended period sounds appropriate.
Yeah. And, I tried the Pomodoro, but like I said, Pomodoro works if you're doing email tasks and other things. But studying medicine, it took about 20 minutes to just kind of load my brain and get everything booted up in a place where I could learn rapidly. I'm not saying that that's the sweet spot for everyone, but what I am saying is it's good to cultivate self-awareness and do experiments on yourself to find what's your sweet spot.
I also love to meditate and used to use mindfulness meditation during lunch breaks, for instance, just to sort of reset my brain before the second part of the day. So I love those bits of advice there. I think they're very useful for all students to use.
Yeah.
For resources, are there any other outside resources that come highly recommended by you for students?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned finances, and that's a big part of where I see a lot of med students. We go into a lot of debt going through med school. That can lead to a fear-based mentality, which can lead us to make decisions out of fear. And these are some pretty big decisions, like what type of residency do I choose? Where do I go? What type of practice do I want? And I see a lot of young doctors making the choice of what gives the most money at the expense of their well-being. And it has this big negative impact of burnout. So I think learning financial awareness early on is really valuable. Some books I love for that. One is called Your Money or Your Life, and another one is called The Millionaire Next Door. Books like that help to get perspective on what is the role of money, kind of how much happiness can it bring. Newsflash, money does not bring happiness. There's a concept called hedonistic adaptation. Gains or loss of big amounts of money, people get back to their baseline level of happiness. It is a tool and it creates freedom, but having the education to really know what you want long term, what money does and doesn't bring, will help guide decisions about residency, buying your first house, all these things down the line. I know for me, I had really good grades and everyone was telling me to go to dermatology. They're like, if you can't go into derm, you have to go into derm. Out of fear, I thought, gosh, maybe I should do that. And I actually applied to and went through, interviews for derm. Then somewhere I heard about doctors in Sweden. I'm not even sure if this is true, but what someone said is that all doctors, regardless of specialty, are paid the exact same. And so I imagined, okay, if I was paid the exact same, what would I want to be doing? And it would be, at that time, it was psychiatry and working on mental health and mental emotional well-being. That has been very valuable in my life, to have that awareness around money, and doing that mental experiment helped me to make the right choice for me in terms of residency.
And probably takes a lot of stress off of your thought process, just having a plan, having a backup plan, but knowing how things work, since, as you mentioned, we don't really receive that sort of education in medical school. So the unknown is much scarier than the potential outcome.
Yeah. One other side note while we're on this topic, I recommend med students apply to every single merit-based scholarship that's available. I decided that I was going to apply to all the ones I was eligible for. And the crazy thing was, I won a ton of those scholarships. I don't think anyone applies for them because they're too busy. So if there's people wanting to give money to med students and there's this deficiency of med students applying, I guess there's no excuse to apply for scholarships. And I think all in all, I got about like $80,000 to $100,000 over 4 years. So there's money out there, and it just kind of takes applying for it and asking for it.
Do you have a good resource that you'd recommend for that? I wasn't aware of that either.
At our school, we had someone in financial aid who emailed us a list of all the scholarships and the requirements. And I just set aside time and made a commitment to myself to do it. But I didn't look outside of that for resources. So there may be something out there. I just don't know about it.
Well, maybe if I find another resource when we're done with this call, then I can put that in the show notes and students can start there if their school doesn't have a pre-made list.
Yeah.
All right. Now that we're getting towards the end of the conversation here, I wanted to first ask if you have any projects in the works.
Right now, kind of this work in accelerated learning has taken a back burner to my medical practice. I'm actually starting my own practice closer to home. In residency, I wrote the kind of outline and some rough draft of Residency 2.0. There's a lot of new challenges in residency. So I kind of took notes of a lot of those things in residency and wrote that outline. And I'd love to create a course, because a course to follow up on the Med School 2.0 book that helps people who are really wanting to take the leap learn and master this use of electronic flashcards and retrieval practice as the primary mode of learning. Yeah, if I had the time, and that's what I would do, I'd probably create a kind of expert course on retrieval practice learning for a small amount of committed individuals and do that residency book.
We should definitely talk. I think making courses is a great way to really get information out in more depth to the students and to the audience of this podcast. And as a part of FreeMedEd, we like to make courses for students. So that might be a good thing to discuss in the near future.
Yeah. There's one other strategy I wanted to share with people that I used for psych boards and family med boards. And it was using a digital voice recorder in the car or when I was running. I would listen to lectures, board prep courses, and there's even an app called Pocket on the iPhone, at least, that will do voice to text of web pages.
I do believe Pocket has a Chrome extension as well, so you can do research on both platforms, your computer and your mobile.
Yeah. So it would read it to me when I'm running, biking, or in the car. And so I would just listen, pause, dictate any notes, and then I would send those notes through Odesk for someone who would make Anki cards for me. I would send them the voice file, and then they would send back it dictated, typed out with Anki cards. So I had a little more money in residency. So if people have extra money, that's another strategy of having a virtual assistant make your cards for you.
That's one I wouldn't have thought to do, and to hire basically a virtual assistant to make the cards for you, since you're obviously very busy during residency and can't do that yourself necessarily. Great tip there.
Yeah, so I wanted to throw that out there because that was the most recent strategy I used for boards, and that worked really well.
I like to finish off the segment with what I call a walk down memory lane. Just a couple of rapid fire questions for you. Take as much time as you like to answer them. First one, anything you wish you could remember better?
Yes, EKGs. Right before the cardiology final, I went to Burning Man with a group of friends. I'd never been. I always wanted to go, and obviously did not study at all when I was there. And so I studied most for my cardiology exam on the drive home from Nevada, Black Rock City. And so EKGs, I just completely skipped because it was such a low amount of questions on the test. But now it's really relevant to me. And so I've had to kind of relearn and reteach myself EKG interpretation.
Oh, I still have to reteach myself that like every other month, basically. Question 2, looking back now, is there anything you would have changed about how you approached medical school?
Yeah, another good question. I wish I did a little more of the mental work around residency choice and money earlier on. That kind of came just in the moment, like, oh, shoot, it's time to choose a residency. And so that was more stressful for me than it needed to be. What ended up being really helpful was the annual meetings for each specialty usually have audio programs. If you ask for it for free, a lot of times they'll just give it to you for free. Say, hey, I'm a med student. I really wanted to go to the conference. I couldn't. Is there any way I could get a scholarship? And I got those. And as I listened to what was being talked about in the different specialty groups, I did it for psychiatry, family medicine, dermatology. That really helped crystallize for me what I wanted to do. Instead of all the travels, I wish I spent a little bit of that free time shadowing people doing what I wanted to do. So I can really get a clear picture of a perfect day 10 years in the future and then reverse engineer how I would arrive there.
That makes perfect sense. Trying to scramble last minute and do all of the research you need to do for the different programs at every different school. Very stressful.
Yeah.
Last question I have for you. Is there anything you wish you did differently in your current career or side gigs?
One thing that I think is really useful to learn is the art of delegation. As you move from resident to attending, it's useful to be very good at delegating tasks to your medical assistants, to your receptionists, so that you're doing best use of your time. And then practicing that with medical assistants and now virtual assistants.
Okay. So what is the best way for people that would like more information to get in touch with you?
Probably through Facebook or my email. I put my email in the book. It's studycoachmd@gmail.com. And the Facebook group, it's also in the book. I think it's facebook.com/studycoachmd.
Perfect. And we'll put those in the show notes for sure, as well as a link to your book.
Yeah. And if people are really wanting a online study mastery course or the residency book, email me to let me know and let me know kind of what your pain points or the biggest problems you have are. It's hard to write something or spend all the time if I'm not sure people are going to use it. But if there's enough people who say, yeah, we really want this, we'll use it, then that can help me to prioritize just getting it done.
I know the feeling. Currently working on a book myself and just trying to get the motivation right now is difficult.
Right?
Well, Dr. Larson, thank you so much for coming on the show. Are there any parting points that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, thank you for listening. Thank you for being curious about investing your time in more efficient learning. And I just advocate keeping in mind the big picture purpose of promoting well-being and preventing burnout, which is becoming an epidemic problem in physicians today, and med students, residents, the whole gamut. Over 50% are suffering from burnout. And it's something the research shows clearly happens at the beginning of medical school. It's not a personality trait prior to that. It's something in the training. So the training programs are trying to change and they're trying to get better, and I commend them for that. At the same time, I also wish that all students take it upon themselves that they're the boss of their own well-being and to prioritize that. And when you create free time by studying efficiently, don't just use it to, watch TV or browse social media. Use it very intentionally for self-care.
Great points. Well, Dr. David Larson, family physician and author of Medical School 2.0, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You got it. Thank you, Chase.